Why, at the end of it all, everything that happens, they should be concerned because everything that happens end up affecting the people they are fighting for. Now we come at a time when a lot of things are happening on the African continent, and the political democracy activists or human rights activists are extremely concerned and wondering about where we are heading. To many, they've already made a conclusion that Africa is heading to its own extinction. Others are, of course, optimistic about what might come. However, the conversation is still a bit huge, and we are going to be trying to get deeper. Today, while covering the Uganda People's Congress press conference, the chairperson of the party called upon the government to do more if it doesn't want to see the wave that is actually appearing or that has been seen across the African continent. We have to take a look at this story. Then from there, I'll be letting you know who we have in the studio, and the conversation will have to continue. Keep your eyes on Record TV.
The National Resistance Movement government headed by President Museveni could have scored on different fronts. But to the Uganda People's Congress UPC, a lot still has to be done if the three-decade government is to survive the people's wave that is ousting regimes that have failed to meet expectations of the population. To the chairman of the party that has steered the country twice, Okai Lawrence, issues of policies that do not address people's concerns will make it difficult for the NRM to survive the wave that has swept leaders across Africa.
Economy needs to better for all of us, and the matters that are ought to be addressed holistically, since the people's uprisings is an idea anchored on endemic issues affecting our respective societies.
Addressing the party's weekly press conference at the party headquarters in Kampala, Okai said this is the time for the NRM government not to continue burying its head in the sand, but draw lessons and address issues of transitional politics, succession, and electoral reforms.
UPC notes with concern that the unresolved issues of succession, transition politics, and electoral reforms are key national issues.
This as he poses questions to why the growing economy, as frequently pointed out by President Museveni, has failed to support equally the population.
The standard of living is going down as the cost of living is rising up every now and then. This country was able to provide for us. We were probably then 6 million people. But the economy then was able to provide for us as a country. We have been fed with figures, and I also believe actually that the economy has grown by far.
Information from Sudan is slim about where he could be, but fingers are pointing at him being under self-custody amid this unrest by the population demanding a civil-led government. Report compiled by Paul Matovu for Speak Uganda, Record TV.
Good evening and welcome to the People's Agenda Show. My name is Mordecai Mlisa Martin Jr. and we happen to let you know about what is happening across the entire world. Of course, starting with our motherland, Uganda, continental Africa, and of course, spreading our hands to Europe, America, Asia, to mention but a few. I just hope that you're doing okay. If not, I just believe everything will be all right, just like I always dedicate to you the song of one Bob Marley, Three Little Birds, where he says, don't worry, everything is going to be all right. For your own information, Africa has had at least 200 coup d'etats or uprising protests that have seen leaders losing power. And what happens after that? It is always shedding tears and a little bit of a smile. Tonight in the studio, I have two gentlemen that are going to be having a conversation with me about what it really means, what these signs that really show that, you know, we are about to have a coup d'etat, not only a coup d'etat or an overthrow or anything. To me, they need no introduction, but to you, they will definitely need an introduction. Good evening.
Good evening.
Happy to see you.
Happy seeing you.
Let these people know who I'm talking to.
My name is Nicholas Kalunji. I'm a digital proficient journalist.
A digital proficient journalist who we have in the studio, Nicholas Kalunji, and Mr.
Crispy Kaheru. I'm the coordinator of the Citizens Coalition for Electoral Democracy in Uganda, CEDU.
Awesome. Well, let me start with you, Mr. Crispy Kaheru. Being the fact that you come from the Citizen Coalition for Electoral Democracy in Uganda, if you were asked randomly about the democracy in the African countries, do we really have hope, or we could be hitting a dead end?
Thank you very much. First of all, let me say thank you for inviting me to Record TV.
It's a pleasure.
After a very long time.
Oh.
Secondly, in regard to the type of democracy or the democracy that we have on the African continent, whether we have hope or not, I think the definition of democracy on the African continent has been so narrow. It's been very limited to just the political democracy. And I wish to make this observation, that political democracy that denotes elections, that denotes a type of multi-party democracy, that denotes, a structured independence of state institutions, is actually meaningless if it is not backed by social democracy. And I want to further add that on the African continent, we have concentrated a lot on putting in place elections every so often, maybe 4, 5 years. We have concentrated on putting in place multi-party politics, where you have so many political parties. You have concentrated on ensuring that you have the 3 stones of government, the legislature, the judiciary, and the executive. But we have not paid attention to the quality of elections that we conduct. We have not paid attention to the meaningfulness of the political parties that we have created. We have not paid attention to the actual independence of the state institutions that we put in place. And then, secondly, I say that once political democracy is not backed by social democracy, then we are in for a danger. We've not paid attention to things like liberty of the people, the freedoms of the people. We have not paid attention to equality. I mean, the whole notion of equality of opportunities or equal open access to equal opportunities, we haven't paid attention to that. And we haven't paid attention to the notion of fraternity, freedoms to associate, to assemble. Now, that is why we end up with a problem, because we concentrate on the things that can be seen, such as conducting elections every so often, such as putting in place multi-party political parties, a pluralistic system, even though it doesn't work, even though parties are actually, not given an opportunity to do what they're supposed to do. We concentrate on putting in place the organs of government, even though we know that one of those organs is actually exercises dominance and is overbearing. A case in point, here in Uganda, we have the executive arm of government, which is very dominant compared to the other 2 organs of government, compared to parliament, compared to the legislature. And that is why, occasionally, you've actually had the head of the executive of this country coming out very clearly to say they can do away with parliament, they can change the judges at their whims if the judges make wrong decisions. And yet, these 3 organs of government are supposed to be equal. So, in short, what I'm saying is that the quality of democracy on the African continent remains lacking simply because it's been narrowly defined.
Awesome. It is lacking, according to him. What is your perception about the African democracy? When he talks about the toothless institutions or three arms of government, legislature, judiciary, and of course the executive, do you see really, let's bring it down in Uganda. Is he really saying yes, or do you rhyme with him?
Okay, thank you very much, Martin. First and foremost, I think he gives a very strong case about democracy. And from the background of what he does, he clearly understands democracy from the perspective of what he does.
What is your
my opinion about democracy is, one, democracy is overrated. Overrated in a way that before we got independence, for instance, we had kings in these countries, in these cities of ours. Kabarega, Mutesa, among others. People say who lived then that those leaders were good and were not democratic. You can question that, but we are not democratic. Fast forward, the people from Europe and Western countries introduced what they call democracy, which was a good thing. When they say government of the people, for the people, by the people, among others, it makes it a very interesting concept that all of us are involved in whatever is happening. And ideally, everyone should be somehow, somewhere involved in efforts of developing their countries. Now what happens is, they brought that idea here when first we're just at the takeoff stage. You know, in economics, there are stages of growth and development. There is a stage of ancient stage. So we are coming from an ancient stage, we are going to the first step. If it were human beings, a baby starting to crawl or walk. So they brought an idea of a youth already, democracy. We didn't understand it, but we took it up. Now, all the mistakes that have been happening, there's a man I always watch and listen to, is called Mutai Ngunyi in Kenya. He says things never go wrong, but rather things start wrong. So democracy in Africa started... Things
never go wrong,
yeah, they start wrong. So the concept of democracy was brought in Africa, which was a good concept, but we were not ready. We were not educated enough, we were not prepared enough to have democracy. So the after effects of whatever we have had are because things never went wrong, but they started in the wrong way.
Do you think now we are ready to accept the concept of democracy?
Now, ideally, we should be ready. The issue is so many mistakes have happened that need to be corrected before we fully embrace democracy. Now, that is the problem. But after 50 years, really 55 years of independence, we are ready for democracy. But because there have been so many mistakes committed knowingly or unknowingly by several people, leaders and not leaders, among others, now it's like we are again starting all over again.
Let me get to where you say democracy is overrated. What did you really mean?
What I mean, I gave you an example that before democracy was brought in Africa, for example, we had our kings and things were smooth, were moving in a very good way. But since they went away, democracy came about, little is happening. So to those that think democracy is a very good thing, I have no issue with them. My opinion is they are giving democracy so much respect that it doesn't deserve, more so in Africa. Yes.
Well, when we go back to the France of 1789, where the president said, later testimony, I am the state, they never had democracy. King Louis of the 16th said, you know, all absolute power of the state belongs to me. That tries to show us where they have come a long way. That today we can look at Macron and we can be able to admire.
Said when was that?
In the 70s.
Exactly. So in the 17 something,
yes, 17.
They already realized that there was a problem, so they started building structures. He knows very well and will tell you, democracy thrives on structures, proper structures. You're a presenter, he's a moderator, he's the MD, they are clear structures. Democracy thrives when that is there. So they started building that in the 17 somethings. The Napoleon eras, the Napoleons are out of the system, King Louis is bad, Bourbon monarchies are bad, then they start building a good thing. Now for us, after they came in the end of the 18th century, in the 19th century, they started talking about democracy. Then they gave us independence 60 years ago. Then you think we are going to be like them?
Mr. Crispy Kaheru, some political analysts say that we received independence when we are not ready. And they say that if independence probably was given to us in 1990s, that would be nice. And he says about when you look at the 56 years of independence, we still have this. Well, it could be 70 or 60 in other countries, but we still have coups, uprising protests that are aimed at having leaders leave power, but at the end of it all, they affect the ordinary Ugandans, the ordinary Kenyans, to mention but a few. And actually, it started in the years when we had received independence, the post-independence era, the likes of Kwame Nkrumah. It was just a few years after independence, it started off.
Well, I want to take exception of the statement that we received independence too early by observing that the Africans have always been independent, right from time immemorial. Maybe what you're talking about is
having down the Union Jack.
A change in system, because when the colonialists came, they superimposed their systems and structures on the African people. But that doesn't mean to say that the African people didn't have their systems and structures which were working. I think a point that my colleague here ably makes. But that notwithstanding, I think also saying that the lowering of the Union Jacks across the continent came too early is also not accurate. Because that cannot be an excuse for having the false starts that we are seeing. Let's take an example of Ghana, which you have cited, Kwame Nkrumah. 1957, Ghana gains independence. They go through a spate of, civil wars and liberation struggles even after independence. But then they normalize on a course through Jerry Rawlings. They take off, and Ghana has been on a progressive track politically. So what explains that? Is there something that Ghana is doing that the rest of the African countries are not doing? Of course, I wouldn't compare Ghana to South Africa. South Africa is a recent country in the sense of decolonization and independence. But it's been sort of on a progressive track. If you look at Namibia, I think Namibia has also been on a progressive track, although it's a relatively new country in the sense of it just got its independence the other day. So there are some of those examples on the African continent that have actually anchored their democracy, and we can see that they are on a progressive track. What is it that they have done differently? And I think that is the question that we need to be asking ourselves. What they have done differently is to look at politics as a wholesome game, not a zero-sum game. Politics is not the beginning and the end. There are other things that actually make a society. Economics. Now, you see, most of the countries that I have actually used as examples are countries that have very strong economies. Yeah? South Africa is one of the strongest economies we have on the continent. Of course, Namibia. Ghana is one of the most stable economies that we have on the continent. So, moving beyond just the politics, but also looking at the complete body that makes up a society is important. Where you have a shaky economy, you most likely have a very shaky political space. But also, there is also a tendency right now for people to run away from all the other spheres of life, the businesses, and go to politics. Why is that so? Because there has been a migration of money from the economics to the politics. Most of the money in African states has migrated from business to actually politics. So if you want to find money, you don't actually go into the economy, you go to politics, which explains why right now Uganda has a problem. You see, politics has become a do or die. Why? Because once you go to politics, you have found your luck. You have actually made your gateway to wealth, to riches, to businesses, to contracts, to all these things. And it doesn't matter the level, even at the district level. Many of these councillors are actually running to go for those elective positions just to be able to have leverage in getting local contracts, road contracts, a contract to repair a school, a contract to repair a hospital, a contract to build a clinic or a dispensary by the local government. That is what people are looking for, which you do not find in the business. So many of the businesses are actually depending on politics. Many of the people right now are actually depending on politics. So if you close politics, then you have actually closed the source of income of so many people. And that is also the residence, permanent residence of corruption. So because you have actually closed down the economy, you have opened up the politics. And actually it's even made worse when elective positions are remunerated at rates that are unbelievable. Uganda is one of the highest paying countries when it comes to members of parliament. Actually, Uganda, Kenya, you could say relatively yes, because the economy is good. It's fairly good. But Uganda, with our GDP, and we are paying an MP about $10,000, it raises questions. You go to Europe, members of parliament are not paid that much. I think recently there was a government official that tendered in their resignation in the US. Why? Because her reason was, I need to go back to private business so that I can make money to be able to take my children to decent schools. In Uganda, you would have to resign your private sector job to join politics to be able to send your children to school. You would have to resign your job in an organization, NGO, to join politics to be able to access good health care, because you'll have good health care packs. You will be sent abroad when you're sick. Your children will also be sent abroad when they are sick. Your children will access education. So that is what you get from politics. Economy, dead kabisa. Politics, working as the economy.
Very unfortunate. But then where are we heading if the monetization in the politics has decided to take a center stage, and everyone is joining politics not to serve, but looks at politics as a notion of wealth and riches? Where are we heading?
Okay, thank you, Martin. Two things. One, again, he makes a very strong case of what is happening. The good thing is, whatever he's saying, most of what he's saying are facts that are happening. Everyone knows that is happening. But here is the issue. And now, understanding the African issue can't be done if you compare it with Europe. Okay, in my opinion. So the best way of understanding Africa is by discussing Africa as it is.
Yes, all right.
He has made a case.
Rather, let me take a short commercial break. When we return, you'll be able to pick up from there. The People's Agenda show continues. Let's take a short commercial break. When we return, the People's Agenda will have, of course, to continue. However, I remind you to follow us on our social media platforms, Record TV Uganda. Subscribe to the channel. We are streaming live and on Facebook, Record TV Uganda, and of course on Twitter, at Record TV Uganda.
The Holy Week is a very important week about the history of mankind. 3 days that mark the completeness of the prophecies. Friday, come to pass in the sanctuary and eat the blessed bread. Saturday, bring the keys of your house, business or office, for the Lord Jesus took the keys from the hands of Satan. Sunday of the Passover with the Holy Communion. Do you believe your life and your dreams can be resurrected? There is still a chance for you to understand and apply in your life the true meaning of these days. In the Holy Week, participate in the 3 holy days. Friday of the Passion, Saturday of the Hallelujah, and the Sunday of Passover, the Sunday of Resurrection. 3 days that will mark the history of your life at the cenacle of the Holy Spirit.
Binji bibela umunsi, but you cannot be everywhere. That's why Towadeo Kutusako, all the latest entertainment news. This source, Monday to Friday, Sawasatu, Kunya Izokumacha Taswa.
Social media today has been awash by the news coming in from actually Peru, where former President Alan Garcia had to commit suicide after police arrived at his house to take him to answer, of course, some of the charges, connection with bribery probe, and he said no. And according to the news actually received before I got to on site, it is said that he died in the hospital in Lima. So that actually explains about how what happens here happens in another place, but then it doesn't make it right, just like the gentleman actually emphasizing that point. Before we took a break, Kalunji Nicholas, an analyst and a journalist, was still continuing to explain.
Yes, thank you, Martin. So what I was saying is the African issue is a clear African issue. It is wrong. We need to find a solution to it. Now, my examples are one, in Kenya, just across here, we share so much with Kenya. They are MCAs, they are called members of county assembly. In that case here, they are councillors. They have been in a conference somewhere and they ask the government to give them grants for cars, not loans. The government has been saying, let us lend you money, which you will pay after 3-4 years. The MCAs are saying, no, the MPs are getting grants, we should also get the same. 1 point. Secondly, about democracy, that's why I think it is overrated and it has issues. Again, in Kenya, usually when elections are held, if 2 strong tribes come together, remember in Kenya they vote along tribal lines. For example, if the Kikuyu and the Kalenjin come together, by default there is what they call tyrant of numbers or dictatorship of numbers. Those 2 tribes will take the presidency. Now, if that is democracy, and that is what the whites brought us, there is a very big problem. Having said that, for our country, Uganda, we all like this country, we are going to be here, we are going to live here, so much needs to be done. We need to be a little better in whatever we are doing. Me, I always tell people that I think Uganda's problem is not at the top. The problem is at the bottom of the pyramid. We have accepted so many bad things to happen. We are doing them. A border man is stopped by a traffic officer, he bribes him. A taxi driver is stopped by a KCCA officer, he bribes him. Some parents are called to some schools in Parents Teachers Association meetings, and they are told you need to contribute some money to enable your kids excel. And know what happens? They contribute money to cheat exams. Now, if you are doing such things, you have no moral authority whatsoever to say that a minister is corrupt. You are paying money to help your kid excel in exams, to cheat exams. You see that? Now, those are issues that most people ignore, and they say, no, the MPs are bad, the ministers are bad, maybe the president is bad. When the bad in them is the same bad in you. Yes.
Well, we started off with looking at the chairperson of the UPC, saying that if nothing is done or there's a need to do more by the NRM government in order not to see the uprising. Looking at what has been happening in other countries with overstaying in power and probably dictatorship, do you think or do you see this coming in Uganda?
The uprising?
The uprising and protest. The coup d'etat.
I don't think that we need to be too excited about what has been happening in the other countries. First and foremost, the countries which have recently had these uprisings are not Uganda. Algeria is not Uganda. Sudan is not Uganda. And even when you look at the architectures of those countries, they are significantly different from Uganda. I think one of the things that we need to notice is that Algeria and Sudan both have very high urban population. Algeria and Sudan have a very big middle class that is employed in corporate companies, multinationals. These are all petrodollar economies. They depend on revenues from the oil. But also, these are countries that actually have very high GDP. They all actually rank within the top 10 high GDP countries of the African continent. Uganda is not one of them. But that aside, I think there is also parallels that we can draw from these countries. That actually would cause a worry for a country like Uganda. Number one, you could actually say that these are both countries that have had leaders that have been in power for more than 15 years. Algeria, 20 years. Sudan, Omar Bashir, 30 years. And that's a bit worrying. But also, you can also clearly tell that these are countries where the leaders of those countries actually came in with the backing of the army. Algeria, Bouteflika, comes in backed by the army through an election where he is a sole candidate in 1999. And then he consolidates his power around himself as, of course, the president and the commander-in-chief of the armed forces of Algeria. On the other side, we look at Sudan, whereby you have a leader that comes in through a coup, through a military coup, and then consolidates themselves as, one, the head of state, two, as the head of government, three, as the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, all three in one person, as he went along. And that, in effect, created a situation that you had a very dominant executive in both countries that rendered all the other organs of government very weak. So the power was consolidated in the presidents of these countries, both in Sudan and Algeria. Something that you could closely relate to when you speak about Uganda. You have a very dominant executive, very overbearing executive. You have the parliament and the judiciary, that may not adequately assert themselves, and sometimes their independence is infringed upon by the executive. But also there is one important thing that I want to observe, please. That in both of these two countries that we are looking at, Algeria and Sudan, these are countries that have primarily held elections right on time. Actually, as we speak, I think both countries are supposed to be holding elections round about this time. I think between the 17th and 19th of April this year. When we look at Algeria, what was the main cause of contention? It was because Abdelaziz Bouteflika wanted to run for office again. And yet he had been ineffective. His health couldn't allow him to transact business as a president. He was invited to embark on electoral reforms. Yeah? Does that sound familiar?
Definitely.
For Uganda? He was invited to put in place an independent electoral management body. That was the beginning of the bone of contention in Algeria.
It sounds so familiar to Uganda.
Does it sound familiar? Now, he refuses. And yet there has always been an adage in Algeria that once Bouteflika appears on the ballot, it's a given. That election, we can actually tell who is going to win. Same as Sudan, that once Omar Bashir appears on the ballot paper, we know who is going to win. So, Algeria, the trigger point could have been the lack of electoral reforms. Actually, the opposition political parties had vowed to boycott any subsequent elections in Algeria. In Algeria, the trigger point could have been electoral reforms, the lack of electoral reforms. In Sudan, it was the lack of economic reforms. So, the reform, we're talking about reform. And our country here, we have been very averse to anything to do with reform. Don't change the status quo. Just keep it as long as it works for whoever is there in power. Don't change it. And that's what we have seen. So there are parallels that we can actually draw from both countries to our local situation here. Thirdly, I think these are countries that you notice that they've not given space to citizens to have conversations. The point of assembly. They both in Algeria and Sudan, there hasn't really been space to allow citizens to dialogue with their leaders. Now, I'll tell you something, that many times leaders think that as long as there is an election, it is done. You know, the citizens have spoken to the leaders, and the leaders have gotten a chance to interact with the citizens. You know, at rallies in our countries, leaders stand on rostrums, they stand on the stage and speak to the people. The people actually don't get an opportunity to speak back. The only way the people speak back is that after the rally, we go to the ballot and vote. Many times, whatever happens in the polling booth could be subject to manipulation. I think you've had the whole debate that increasingly many of the African countries are having computer-generated leaders, you know? But also leaders that actually shoot to power, shoot to elective offices with the backing of the army.
Well,
now, let me just complete this. Some of those factors that exist in both Algeria and Sudan could easily relate to the situation, the situation in Uganda. So that raises questions on whether the circumstances that pertained in those countries could actually come here. But I also want to make it very clear that Uganda has actually distinguished itself in one thing. I think there is an increasing appetite to create more and more spaces of dialogue where citizens have conversations with their leaders. Now, that's an exception because in the other two countries, Citizens did not have those spaces. There was no opportunity to dialogue. There was no opportunity for leaders to interact with the citizens. Whereas in Uganda, with the current cause of national dialogue, that could be a pathway that would actually be a detour to the contagion effect that would have come from either Algeria or the neighboring Sudan.
Getting to you, well, he says that Ugandans should not be excited with what has happened in Algeria and at the same time Sudan. But well, social media you follow. People power is chanting. Mr. Museveni, you should be able to see what is happening in those countries. And please be in knowledge that it can happen to you. And 2021, twebereremu, as they use, that is people power, funa indagamuntu, and they say it is a do or die. Do you see this coming?
Okay, first and foremost, whatever has happened in Sudan and Algeria might be seen as a good thing, but I will tell you for free, whatever is happening in those countries is wrong. And it sets a very bad precedent. On one hand, there are leaders that are perceived to be bad.
So to a large extent, it is very bad.
At the moment, on one hand, there are leaders that are perceived to be bad. On the other hand, there are armies overthrowing elected leaders. So for the general public, it might look like Bashir has left because of our pressure. But on the other side of the coin, it is the army that has taken over.
But well, that's how we came.
No, here is the thing. If you say the army people have had issues, they are not good at governance. But it's the same army taking over. The army where Bwana Bashir has been, or the commander-in-chief, whatever he has been, is exactly the same army that is taking over. That's why you see
that's why people are keeping on streets.
I'm coming there. That's how I've told you what is happening might be good, but the way it is happening, army taking over from another person from the army. First thing. Now bringing it closer to Uganda, first and foremost, my thinking is what happened in Sudan or what happened in Algeria is a continuation of the Arab Spring. There are clear factors that led to the Arab Spring since 2010. Egypt, Tunisia, Middle East, among others, Syria, those things have been happening. So what is happening there is a continuation of that. Thirdly, I'm sure what has happened in those countries can happen in Uganda. The question is, when can it happen? It can't happen very soon. Not in the next 5 or 10 years. But it can happen.
Why are you so...
Okay, here is the thing.
Where do you get that confidence of not in 5 or 10 years?
See, like he has said, there are some similarities and several differences. Now, I don't want to repeat the things he said, but from the differences between Uganda and maybe Algeria or Sudan, I'm constrained to conclude that if it is to happen in Uganda, it will take some time. Now, back to some issues he has talked about. My biggest problem with our people here, mainly politicians, they are bad losers. They don't accept defeat. Now, you might ask for reforms. Reforms will be made, and again, they won't be accepted. Case in point, in Kenya had issues 2007. People killed each other. They brought in a new constitution in 2010. The new constitution brought what is called the Independent Electoral and Boundaries Commission, IEBC. When the time of choosing the chairperson and the board came, and the commission executives came, the political parties, ODM, Ford Kenya, Jubilee Kenya, Wiper, among others, sent representatives and together selected the commissioners, led by Chebukati as the chairperson. Move forward, 2017, they held an election. The Independent Electoral and Boundaries Commission led an election which was held in Kenya. As soon as one party lost, they said the results were generated by computers. ODM, or NASA in that case, led by Honorable Raila Odinga, said the elections were wrong, the results were generated by computers. He went to the Supreme Court. You know what happened? The election was nullified. They went for a repeat election. He withdrew from the election. Now, first he went to ask for this thing to be done all over again. Now, after him getting the chance to do it all over again, he withdraws from the election. Another election happens, Jubilee competing against itself. Because the other peripheral candidates couldn't do much. I think it's called a coup, the guy who remained in the race. He couldn't do much. Again, Jubilee wins, and this guy said the results were computer generated. Fast forward, after a few months, the same fella discusses his issues with the president, and they come up with what is known as the infamous handshake. Now, this man who went and saw himself in as the people's president of Kenya decides to work with the president he thinks rigged an election. Right now, all over media, social media or mainstream media, the discussion is Uhuru and Raila Odinga might have an agreement. They want to shortchange Ruto. You see that? Now, this is the same leader who said these guys are killers, they are murderers, they rig elections, but now is very happy, is embracing them for the sake of peace. But is that peace? Or he has his hidden agenda at this point? Now, that is my problem with most African leaders. When things are working in their favor, everything is okay. When they are losing, everything is wrong. Now, the same happens here. Martin, I'm quite sure, even if you were the Electoral Commission boss and you held an election here in Kamoja, and people stood in lines, Nicholas and Kaheru gets 100 votes and Nicholas gets 90. You will be surprised that tomorrow Nicholas will say the vote was rigged. Because we haven't been trained to accept when things don't work in our favor. It is a big African problem.
Well, at times it is very difficult to accept defeat. Well, it says, he who pays the piper calls the tune. We're talking about an electoral commission where the chairperson is elected by the president.
And I've given you an example. Charles Chebukati in Kenya was on an ODM candidate in 27 elections. So he was an ODM man. He was made the chairman of the electoral commission. But in 2017, Odinga and his team said Chebukati is rigging us, yet he was their member. You see that? Now, you have given an Ugandan example, I've given you a Kenyan example, where all parties came together. Okay, here, the president appointed. There, all parties came together. But even after that happened, again, they said they were rigging in the elections. The problem is, we don't accept when things don't work in our favor. Kahel here comes from the NGO world, right? There are usually people called observers, and I think his team is always part of the observation. Whenever we have elections here, we get reports from observers. They are sponsors from Europe, European Union, of our World Bank, among others, those who are European countries. They release reports and say the elections were fine. You see that? Now, that's where the contradiction comes from. Now, the whites we praised from Europe of having very good democracies will come here and say the elections were fine, and we say the whites are lying.
Now to you,
yes.
who comes from the non-government organization, he says that you seem to be disappointing or creating the controversy in Ugandans when you come out and say the election has been free and fair in one or the other. And many Ugandans are saying, no, probably we've lost it. And now I want you to get to the part of the electoral reforms. We could be saying that reforms were made in Kenya, but still, the other side of Raila Odinga never accepted, probably because there are some of the things that were not paid much attention to, and they said we cannot be part of that
Maybe
election.
before he comes in, for the record, the changes in Kenya were made. All political parties, major political parties, signed the memorandum of understanding electing those commissioners. So no one can come out to say we are not part.
Well, for any game, whether it is a social game or political game or economic, it should have rules and guidelines that govern that game. And if you look back as far as 2001 elections, there's been issues with our elections. And actually across the political divide, we all agree about some of the problems that have afflicted our elections.
True.
The question of violence in elections has been very disturbing.
Sure.
From 2001, actually, after the 2001 or 6 elections, there was a standing committee of parliament that was appointed to investigate violence in elections. Right from 2001. It's been a big issue. It keeps increasing. Now, it's even gone to the lowest levels when we are having by-elections in constituencies, not a presidential general election, but at constituency level. You have violence, you have people killing each other, you have people cutting throats. That's dangerous.
And it goes back to what you said, do or die.
That's exactly.
Both sides are on do or die.
Absolutely. It's a very bad signal. Secondly, the whole question of the money in elections. So it's become an issue of what we are talking about. He who has the most money uses that as a political competitive advantage. I will bribe as much as I can so that at the end of the day, I get elected. The end justifies the means. If I need to kill a few people and tape on a few bodies, I will do it. If I need to push out 1 billion shillings, I will do it. In 2000, actually, before I forget, in 2011, a candidate running for the mayoral seat was on one of the radio stations in Kampala and was asked, how much do you spend on a daily? And it was a lady candidate. And she said, I spend 200 million shillings per day.
Wow.
What is that you're chasing in the Lord Mayor's office?
A contract.
At KCCA. So, the question of money in elections, I think, is a very serious issue. The question of the increasing use of technology to manipulate elections, like we've seen in Kenya, it's becoming a serious problem. Uganda is one of those countries that doesn't have any framework for the deployment of technology in elections, which, of course, I wouldn't really be very, very angry at the government, because technology is a new phenomenon. It's just an emerging phenomenon. But it's another window that politicians have learned to use to manipulate elections. So, and so on and so forth. So those are some of the things that have been on the table consistently from 2001 elections, 2006, 2011, 2016. They haven't yet been dealt with. Now, I would rather the opposition politicians, the party in government, sorts out those issues that are actually leading to death, that are reducing confidence of people in elections, and say, the ground is now leveled. Come, if you fail in this competition, it's a fair fail. You'll walk back home and say, yes, I lost the election, but the ground was leveled.
All right, we are running out of time. I will give you 1 minute to conclude.
Yes, 1.5. No,
1
first,
minute.
to react to what he has said. So he's saying the right things. Idea, that's what is supposed to happen. My only issue, Mr. Kaheru, with all of that, you might make all those reforms, and someone again loses, and again they look for reasons.
Which is okay. Let them lose knowing.
We shall again go back in the same circle.
The laws are in place, the practices are in place, voter education is in place, civic education is in place, and I have lost fairly and squarely.
But of course, in principle, the electoral reforms are good, the electoral reforms are needed. But on the other side of the coin, our leaders, all of them, whether in opposition or NIM, should learn and accept that things don't work the same way all the time. Sometimes things don't work in your favor. When they don't work in your favor, please accept.
All right, thank you so much. In 1 minute, Mr. Kaheru.
Well, I think for me the most important thing is the point I've already made, that electoral reforms are paramount to making the subsequent election a fair and free election. And therefore, we must see to it that government puts in place reforms around the deployment of technology to manage election campaign financing, to also nip in the bud the problem of violence in elections, but also, most importantly, educate the people on how they should participate in politics so that the government can nurture a very strong political culture that is based on values.
Thank you so much. I hope we can have some more conversation beyond this. Well, we cannot go beyond this time, but I just want to appreciate you so much for keeping your eyes on Record TV. I want to remind you tomorrow the Supreme Court will, of course, be giving judgment on an appeal filed by a city lawyer, Malema.